Okay, so welcome back to the second part of the marketing decision making end of topic test feedback. So we've the first part one, which is available to you on YouTube, is the multi-choice questions, or questions 1 to 10. So we're going to look at the longer questions now that were posed in the test, questions 11 through to question 15. Obviously, by the very nature of those questions, they're likely to be slightly more complicated because there are higher tariff questions. And I'm going to go through each one and try and help you to unpick exactly what you should have included in the answer. Okay, so let's look at question 11 to start with then. And that is, what is meant by the term market segment? Okay, so 2 marks available there. Well, if you only give a basic definition of what a market segment is, then clearly you're just going to get 1 mark, whereas the detailed definition will get you 2 marks. So an example would be something along the lines of this included here. Okay, so a small group of consumers within a larger market that have similar characteristics. So that would be almost like a basic definition. But then obviously by expanding that a wee bit, you could then say these consumers will respond similarly to chosen marketing strategies. And the reason for segmentation is clearly trying to find out a group of customers that seem to be similar so that you can then target those similarities and those preferences in your marketing activity. Okay, so clearly if you can give some context to your answer, and you could maybe give examples of how markets might be segmented by geography or demographics, etc., that clearly is going to add fuel to your fire and hopefully get you your 2 marks as a result. Okay, so that's question number 11, the 2 marker. So let's have a look at question number 12 then. This one is a 4 marker. Explain how technology has helped businesses gather data for marketing decision making. So clearly we've got to understand different forms of technology that might have helped us to gather data, and then for that data to be then used to make marketing decisions. Okay, so we've got 4 marks here. And typically there are, there's 3 examples of the sorts of things that you can include here. So first things first, obviously one of the things that you could talk about is the online revolution and the fact that we've got so much e-commerce and so many different ways now of tracking the way in which customers might view online data. And that can be using cookies. It can also show users' browsing and buying habits, which clearly can be used then to estimate how they might buy in the future. Obviously, somebody like Amazon or some of the big e-commerce sites will often do people who bought this particular product also bought. So there's all sorts of things that can be done in terms of suggested sales and all that sort of thing based on the data that you're gathering. Okay. Clearly, the other thing that you can do, because computer power is so much more extensive than it ever used to be, and some of the software that's available also is very sophisticated, you can get much larger sample sizes when you're looking at primary research methods, and it's much easier to manipulate the results of that to analyse and spot any consumer tastes or trends that you might be able to exploit, and as a result of that get more sales from your particular market sector. Okay, when we think about the internet and social media apps, can be used very easily to gather data more quickly. If we take ASOS as the example, which we've often quoted, they have the opportunity, because they've got such great links within Facebook and Twitter and various other social media apps, they can pick up data directly from their marketplace very, very quickly, and that allows them to move more quickly and get what's known as first mover advantage. So they're able to get their product to market quicker and hopefully exploit trends more effectively based on the fact that they're getting data real time from a large sample of their market sectors. Okay, so couple of examples there, and obviously you're going to get your 4 marks for explaining, number 1, the technology, number 2, how that can help to inform marketing decision making. Okay, let's have a look at question 13 then. So in this case then we're moving on to look at a slightly different question. In this case we've got to explain 2 benefits of niche marketing. Well, clearly if you only include 1, the maximum you're going to get is 2 marks. So clearly, in this case, you've got to include 2 benefits of niche marketing. Okay, so possible answers could include, if you've got a smaller market segments, you can a business can produce more highly targeted marketing campaigns, can look at really trying to satisfy the requirements of that particular market segment better than anybody else. And by concentrating their resources, they can actually really focus on those smaller market segments and try and produce something that is definitely going to meet the requirements of the marketplace. Okay. You think about that, if you've broken your market down and segmented your market and created a niche, likelihood is you can use promotional methods that are going to be lower cost because you've got smaller markets being targeted, and that's clearly going to reduce your variable cost and then reduce break-even levels for business. So it's quite nice the way that links from one factor into other elements of a successful business. Reducing your variable costs, reducing your break-even means that effectively you're hopefully going to then allow, if you control all your costs, you're going to allow yourself to produce more profit over time. Okay. The third option there, if we specialise in a smaller market, you should have a clearer understanding of your market segment and the characteristics that they show. And that should allow, again, it's an extension really on from the first point. If you can produce a very bespoke product offering and you're going to satisfy your consumers better than your competition, that's going to give you a real competitive advantage, which you can then exploit. Okay. But again, every time that you're doing any question like this where you've got a full marker, try to give some context to your answer. So try and give an example that you might have at your fingertips, or you might have experienced in working at your part-time job or whatever. Okay. Okay, so that's question number 13, worth 4 marks. Let's take a look at question number 14 then. Again, still only a 4 marker, but in this case, we're being asked about a particular model, a marketing model. Okay, so explaining how a business might use the Boston Matrix to help with marketing decisions. Well, if it's a 4 marker, you've sort of got to explain that you understand what the Boston Matrix is. Okay, now it doesn't mean you've got to go into chapter and include chapter and verse on that, but clearly explaining what it is, that should then hopefully remind you as to how you might be able to use that to help with your marketing decisions. Okay, so it's almost a 2-part answer this, I would say. The first thing is to look at the Boston Matrix specifically, and what does it allow you to do? Well, it allows you to look at the level of investment that you as a business might have to make on each of your different business portfolios, dependent on the level of market share that you have and also the market growth. Because if you remember, the Boston Matrix basically compares the two and creates the matrix and creates 4 different areas where your products are likely to be relative to one another. Okay, now it's only really relevant to businesses that have got multi-product businesses. Okay, because essentially what you're trying to do with the Boston Matrix is to take however many products you might have, and then to plot them on the Boston Matrix, and then decide how the finite marketing resources you've got available are going to be best used to achieve the overall marketing objectives that you might be setting for your organisation. Okay, now again, it wouldn't do any harm, and I think it's almost easier to explain if you then look at how you understand the Boston Matrix by using the correct terminology. So the fact is that if we actually use the term dog, a dog product, a cash cow, a star product, and a question mark, that almost, hopefully, if you couldn't remember exactly what the Boston Matrix was, you should be able to remember that in this instance, a dog product is where you've got low levels of market share and low growth. And clearly, that's not necessarily one that you want to be spending humongous amounts of money on. Okay, so you would be allocating a relatively low level of resources to a dog product. Your cash cow is where you've got relatively slow growth, but you've got high levels of market share. What you would need to do is, because it is a cash cow, you're going to be making plenty of profit from your cash cows. You'd definitely need to put enough resources into your marketing activity to maintain your high level of market share. Star product obviously is the one that you're really looking for, because that's where you've got high levels of market share, but you've also got high levels of growth. And clearly in that case, if we've got a really high level of market share where we're a market leader, we want to invest heavily in exploiting that and making sure that if it is a fast growing market, that we're still getting the lion's share to maintain our market leadership position. Okay. And then finally, excuse me, the question mark product. So in this instance, if it's a question mark, it might be that we've got high levels of growth but low market share. Then in that instance, what we need to do is think about whether we can develop this into a star product where we would significantly invest to try to get more market share, or is it not really worth it? Is it going to be too expensive, or do we think it's too risky to do so? And if that were the case, then you would drop that product. Okay, so a little bit more detail maybe than you would need to include in the 4 marker, but just to demonstrate that you understand, number 1, what it's used for, and number 2, some of the terminology, gives a really good and solid answer, okay, for question 14. Okay, let's have a look at question 13, that was 14, sorry, yeah. So let's move on to question 15 then, okay? So this is the really big question on this particular paper, okay? And it's based on the case study of Google Glass, which is about a page or so of really good stuff explaining about Google Glass. Okay, let's take a look at what the question is asking us then for question 15. So it's asking us to analyse the ways in which the marketing mix may change over the life cycle of Google Glass. Okay, we know it's a 16 marker, so as you'll see in the next couple of slides, there is a breakdown of how we should be tackling any 16 mark question, and it's basically, if you remember, pcan times 2 plus a conclusion using dips. Now in this instance, again, sometimes, as we've said before, the question sort of gives you a clue as to the way in which you might be able to split your 2 points that you've got to make. And in this instance, we've got essentially two different models that we're going to have to try and explain how, in this instance, we might be able to apply this to Google Glass. So the marketing mix, the 7 Ps, as we'll look at in a minute, is clearly a model that, and it breaks down the ways in which an organisation is attempting to market both its product, how it prices, how it promotes, where it's distributed, and the processes involved, etc., etc. Okay, but also the life cycle, which is sort of slipped in there, is actually the product life cycle that we need to look at, which is essentially the sales, the level of sales plotted over time, and basically there are 4 or 5 different choices or different stages, and essentially what we need to do in this instance is to say how can we analyse, or how can we actually look at how the marketing mix might change over the life cycle of Google Glass. Okay, so the focus of the question very much how the different elements of the marketing mix, the 7 Ps, if you remember: product, price, promotion, place, process, people, and physical environment, can be used to promote, in this case, Google's new product, Google Glass, and at the different stages of its product life cycle, which clearly are introduction, launch, growth, maturity, and then decline, and possibly extension if you're able to do so. So in essence, to answer this question well, you're going to need to be able to explain that you understand how the marketing mix might change over the product life cycle, and the sorts of things that you would do to market an organization's product at introduction, at launch, and what you might need to do at growth, and then obviously looking at other things that you might need to do as it goes from growth to maturity to decline and then extension, okay, if you can do that. So in this case, what we've done is explained the way in which we might look at the introduction phase. So some indicative content showing the introduction phase. And clearly in this instance, Google Glass is a relatively new concept. It was very new when it first came out. It was very extremely innovative and something that nobody had really seen before. So in that instance, it's very important in your introductory phase that you're actually informing and allowing people to understand a little bit more and become more aware of this particular product. Okay, so the sort of things that you would be thinking about would be thinking about informative and educative above the line advertising to raise awareness and generate interest in the product amongst early adopters. Early adopters is a term that is used quite a lot in marketing, and they are the people who are first into the market. They are the people who are willing to take a risk on a new product or service. Well, Google Glass was an extremely innovative and very new product, and the early adopters in the market would be the ones that would be the first to take that up, or first to sort of test the water and buy that product. Okay. Well, the fact that this was a very innovative product, I would suggest that in this instance, Google would probably choose price skimming. So they'd choose to set this at a high price. And as you can see from the case study, and you will be able to have a look at that, and you should be starting to think about how you might be able to use the case study to demonstrate the point and support the point that you're making in your answer, okay? So clearly, in this instance, we want to be looking at price skimming to recoup some of the marketing and launch investment, because clearly the innovation and the development costs of a product like Google Glass, clearly you want to try and recuperate that. If you're Google, you want to try and recuperate that, gain as much of that as possible, okay? And gain some of that money back by charging a high price, okay? Well, at introductory, because it was so innovative and so different, so new, and it was a very unique product, the feeling was that, and feeling should have been, I think, that the product would only be released in one or a small number of formats or variations, because of the unique nature of the product and also its market positioning. So that gives you an idea of how you might look at the introduction phase, okay? And that demonstrates, number one, that you've understood there are different stages in the product life cycle, and also the different ways in which you might use the marketing of the 7 Ps. Not always, they have to include all of the 7 Ps, okay? Not for a 16 marker necessarily, but certainly demonstrating that you understand the principle of how that all works, okay? So that's the introductory phase. Let's move on and take a look at further indicative content that we could look at, okay? So we've done the intro phase in relative detail, okay? But if we then look at how the product might move into growth, maturity, saturation, and decline phase, well, clearly, once you've gone through the awareness and interest stage, then we're talking about trying to persuade people to move towards a buying decision, okay? So advertising and promotion from sort of growth into maturity should really shift towards a more persuasive message. Emphasis very much still on the uniqueness of the product and the market-leading innovation that has been developed for Google Glass in this, or for Google in this particular product area, okay? And clearly that would be designed to try to gain market share and establish some sort of competitive advantage over any competitor products. The thing that you might also do, or Google should be thinking about, is choose to maybe reduce price during this time in order to make the product a bit more appealing to the mass market and establish a market-leading share of what was a very new and different market, okay? Another factor here, that over time, you might actually also remodel the product, okay? Look at optional features that add to the possibility of creating extension strategies as sales start to decline from the maturity stage of the product life cycle, okay? Now, as you may be aware, Google Glass ended up not being the greatest success for Google, and history sort of has shown us that. And that demonstrates the point that in some cases, if a product isn't achieving the level of sales that it should do, or it was forecast to, in some cases the product might be canned. In this case, I think Google Glass was probably slightly ahead of its time, and as a result, they chose to put the Google Glass product on ice, essentially, and at the moment, I don't think they're actually selling it, are they? So let's take a look at the next thing then. So we looked at the introduction phase. We've looked at the different ways in which our advertising and marketing activity, our marketing mix, might change over time. But then we also need to think about evaluating and putting together a conclusion. So we've looked at the product life cycle. We've looked at the marketing mix and the way those two combine and how they change, how the marketing mix changes over time for, in this case, Google Glass. Now, one of the key things to do is when you're talking about what we just talked about on those last two slides, is give examples from the case study to demonstrate your point, okay? And in this instance, what we've also got to do, once we've done that, once we've looked at the pecan times 2, we've also got to put together some a conclusion with some evaluation, okay? So one of the things that you could do, or a number of the things that you could do, and there are 3 or 4 examples given here. First things first is thinking about how the marketing mix will change dependent on the success of the product, okay? So if we're talking in this instance about a new product offering this in a completely new market, it's a high risk product launch that, but if the product's successful, the marketing mix is going to be significantly different compared to one where the product hasn't been launched all that successfully. So clearly, the overall success of the market and the success of the marketing will have an influence on the way in which the marketing mix is adopted, okay? Another thing that you have very little control over is the economic climate, okay? So the mix that will be adopted, the marketing mix and activity and budgets available, it's going to depend very much on the economic climate. If we've got an economy that's in growth with lots of disposable income amongst our target audience, then we're going to be looking at high levels of promotion, pushing the aspirational nature of the product, and that would be particularly appropriate. However, the opposite of that, if we've got the economy that's in recession, we're maybe going to think more about a strong pricing position, and what I mean by that is we might look at a reduction in price, and maybe even stripping down the product to some degree in order to secure for higher levels of market share, okay? So again, dependent on the external factor, in this case the economic climate, that will obviously have an impact on the different forms of marketing and the amount that we're willing to spend on that particular marketing activity, okay? Obviously, the thing that's also very important in this instance is thinking about the product life cycle, particularly in technology markets, has changed significantly because you've got highly innovative and highly competitive markets. You tend to find that product life cycles are much shorter in these markets than other more traditional ones. So in this instance, businesses in technical markets or technology markets really do have to move quickly and react to market changes to maintain their market position. And clearly, you don't want too many products that are launching and not being particularly successful. So that clearly is, again, going to mean that to some degree, you've got to do your research. You've also got to make sure that you are quite confident and quite combative in your marketing to try and get your message out there in what is a very crowded and very competitive market, okay? Other things that can affect the marketing mix, okay, and to some degree also the product life cycle, could be legal and ethical issues, okay? Now, clearly in this instance, where we had Google Glass, because there were some issues around privacy that's actually spelt out in the case study, and you could use that as an example, then that would, to some degree, cause a bit of a problem for this product, okay? So the privacy issues and the GDPR issues of sharing data and keeping data safe, etc., is something that could have a major effect on, in this case, how this product can be marketed and how it might actually, how that might affect the success of the launch. Okay, so that gives you pecan times 2 and also some evaluative points that you could include. In the last couple of slides, just look at the recommended approach, and this is almost a summary of what we've just gone through, okay? So remember, a 16-mark question is always going to be pecan times 2, point explained with some contextualized analysis, the 2 factors, okay, plus a conclusion using dips, and we'll come back to dips. You should be familiar with that, but we'll come back and look at that in a minute, okay? Now, the first things first, we need to look at the command words in the question. We've been asked that we've got to analyse the ways in which the marketing mix may change the life cycle of Google Glass. So we've got to analyse and demonstrate that we understand what the marketing mix is, and also how those things within the marketing mix might change over the product life cycle of Google Glass. So essentially, we're trying to weigh up marketing activity that you'd recommend at different stages of the product life cycle of Google Glass. Okay, so using context from the case study, I can't emphasize this enough. You must use information that's in the case study that support both the different types of marketing mix and marketing activity that you would consider, and make sure that if the data is there, the information is there, that you quote it and use it to support the points that you are making. Very, very important that, okay? Okay, now in terms of the last bit of the answer then, where we're talking about developing a conclusion, and we've sort of demonstrated that with the example answer and some of the indicative points that you could use in your evaluation. But again, to remind you, if you're having to write a concluding paragraph, using dips is a really good way of considering the wider implications of the question, okay? And you haven't got to use all of these, but trying to use this type of language in your conclusion will definitely help you to consider the wider context of the answer, okay? So in this case, we're looking at depends on. So in this instance, we could be talking about, well, the marketing mix will depend on the level of the economy and whether the economy is in growth or in recession, okay? So clearly, that is going to be dependent on a number of things, and they are external to the organisation, but clearly they could well have an influence, okay? Now, the I is the impact of measures. So if we talked about the different types of measure, in this case, the different types of marketing mix, what would be the impact of those measures on success or otherwise of this particular product promotion, okay? PESTLE is the next one for P, so remember that's different forms of external factor. Just to remind you, P is political, E is economics, S is social, T is technological, L is legal, and E is environmental. So the external factors that the business has no control over, don't have to use all of those. You could use, well, you could complete a conclusion just talking about one of those external factors, but use one or maybe a couple of those. We talked about the economy, okay, and also we talked about technology and legal, in fact. So we've got three of the PESTLE shown in the recommended approach, where we started to look at different ways in which you could break this answer down, okay? Now, again, another way of trying to sort of include and think about this in a wider context is think about both the short-term and the long-term implications that may have an effect on the answer. So in the short term, it might be a good thing to highlight high levels of awareness advertising, but in the longer term, we might need to be thinking about, you know, how long are we going to keep going with a product like this if we're not getting the sales returns that we were hoping to, okay? And finally, bringing it back to solution to the question, okay? Make sure you bring your conclusion to a close by answering the question. So effectively, go back and look, have you answered the question? Have you actually covered the points that the examiner has asked for, okay? And that is your recommended approach for question number 15. Okay, so that concludes the feedback for marketing and decision making. It covers the questions in 11 through to 15, and hopefully that's been useful. And obviously, if you've got any questions on any of that, please let me know, and also any feedback on whether you found this useful or any improvements that could be made. That would be very helpful too. So I'll sign off there, and my plan will be to set you some new questions over the next week or so, which will allow you to use both the operations and the marketing decision making and the topic feedback test to help you to understand this process. Okay, thank you very much for listening.